In today's video, I'm going to be reviewing Pigment. Pigment is a planning platform used by companies like Airtable, Brex, and Figma. Speak to any CFO and they'll tell you that a proper planning tool is one of the best investments that you can make. Any salesperson will probably also tell you that. But 50% of implementations are failures, and planning platforms have one of the worst customer satisfaction ratings in all of SaaS. Pigment obviously is trying to change all that, so I sat through 9 hours of demos with the Pigment team, spent more hours speaking to some of their customers so that I could tell you everything their sales team didn't in less than 15 minutes. Now, today's video is split into 9 parts, so feel free to skip around. First, I'll start off by telling you what the hell a planning platform actually does, and I'll pull up some demo recordings and show you a product tour of Pigment. First, I'll show you how Pigment connects to data. Then I'll show you how Pigment allows you to visualize the data using fancy charts and tables. Then we're going to talk a little bit about the modeling and how you kind of create formulas and create forecasts. Then we're going to touch on scenarios. Then we're going to touch on workflow and collaboration features. And once we're done with all of that, I'll touch a little bit on the implementation process itself. At the very end of the video, I'll tell you why I think that Pigment only makes sense for companies of a certain size. If there's any questions not answered in today's video that you want to know about, write a question in the comments. I'll respond to either directly or I'll do a whole nother video. Without further ado, let's roll. So I said earlier in the video that Pigment is a planning platform. What does that actually mean? Planning platform, or budgeting and forecasting software, or corporate performance management system, whatever you want to call it, essentially does two things. First, it allows businesses to create forecasts or plans for different parts of their business. And second, it allows businesses to measure their progress towards those forecasts, towards those goals. Now, most companies start off doing their planning in Excel or Google Sheets. Everybody knows how to use Excel. Cheap, it's fast, it's very flexible. But as a company scales, spreadsheets start to break. And that's where Pigment comes in. Now, companies keep their data in lots of different systems. Keeping the financial model up to date is really manual, really inefficient, and very error prone. What Pigment allows you to do is to consolidate all of that data across from all your different systems into a single source of truth and semi-automate the process of keeping it up to date. There are 2 ways to connect your data into Pigment. The first way is to use one of Pigment's native pre-built connectors. These connectors plug directly into your source system. Very quick to set up. Once you're set up, you can pretty much automate the entire process. Currently, Pigment only has 80 native connectors available. So it's kind of limited. The second way of bringing data into Pigment is via CSV upload. You can bring in data pretty much from any system in this way. Whatever system you've got will probably have a CSV export, and that will allow you to bring data into Pigment. The cons, obviously, is that it's a fairly manual process. For me, the marginal gains of going from Excel in the data side are pretty small. Like most planning platforms, Pigment uses an OLAP database. The only thing that you need to know about an OLAP database is that it stores data in a multi-dimensional structure, which then allows you to query much larger data sets, to slice and dice data however you want. What this means is that before you bring any data into Pigment, you have to really think carefully about the dimensions of your data and how you're going to structure it. And once you've thought about your data and how you're going to structure it, then you have to make sure that it matches the structure of your objects in Pigment. So in other words, lots of pre-planning involved in bringing in data. Because once you've settled on a structure and then you want to change it down the road, it can be fairly fiddly, so you're going to want to get it right the first time around. So if you said that Excel's primary user interface is a spreadsheet, I think you could also say that the Pigment's primary user interface is the dashboard. Dashboards are essentially where 90% of work gets done in Pigment and how most of the people in your company will be interacting with it. Now, you can create a dashboard for pretty much anything, and you can have dashboards that not only show you data, but also get inputs as well. So in this example, we have just a general cost center board that gives us an overview of the workforce. We have a graph that shows us how we're doing on attrition. There's a waterfall chart that shows where we expect our head count to look at the end of the year. So one of my favorite features of Pigment is actually the filters. These filters allow you to create cross sections of your model that you can share with specific people. So here we've actually created a filter for direct sales. So this filter will only show cost center numbers for direct sales specifically in the United States. And this is such a huge step forward from Excel, because instead of creating different workbooks that you share with different people just to create different views of your model, you can actually have everything synced together and shareable with a single click. And you don't have to run around keeping the different workbooks up to date either. Now, having all the latest data at your fingertips is all well and good, but then how do you analyze it? Once you have your data structured in Pigment, you can essentially analyze it across any dimension, and that's thanks to the powers of the OLAP database that I mentioned earlier. In this example, we have a regional P&L dashboard which contains the income statement. You can open this up as a pivot table, remove the regional column just to see the data in aggregate, and then to compare quarter-on-quarter changes, you can just use one of the pre-built functions in Pigment. Obviously, any data visualization tool like Looker allows you to visualize data. A planning tool needs to allow you to actually forecast the future. And that's where modeling becomes really important. Pigment says that modeling is very similar to Excel. I don't think that's necessarily true. And here are the major differences. Number one, there are no cell references in Pigment. When you're writing a formula, you basically have to name the object that you're referencing. Instead of writing B2 times C2 to calculate your growth next month, what you probably do is write a formula that just says revenue times growth rate assumption. Secondly, you have to define the data structure of all of your objects up front. That means you have to define the dimensions of your data before you can use it in a formula. Thirdly, if you want to perform a calculation on multiple blocks, you need to ensure that the number of dimensions matches up in each object. They have to have the same number of dimensions before you perform a calculation. So what that means is you have to often do some form of aggregation or some form of kind of formula writing in order to get the number of dimensions to match before you can write even a very simple formula. When you've written the formula, Pigment allows you to drill into it and see its dependencies and see how it's being used throughout the model. Because there's so much scope for error when writing formulas, there's so much kind of technical skills required, most of the companies that I spoke to centralized the formula writing to 1 or 2 people in the company. The downside of having a couple of people just doing the formula writing in your company is that not only do you have to spend a lot of time training them, it also probably means that you'll still do a lot of your ad hoc modeling outside of Pigment in something like Excel or Google Sheets. So sometimes companies will find themselves maintaining 2 quite large systems alongside each other. It can be a bit of a headache. If you've ever done an annual budget for your company, you'll know that it's not a one and done task. You'll need to make changes to your model throughout the year, and Pigment allows you to bring that whole process out of spreadsheets into a single platform. Let's have a look at Pigment makes it easier for team leads to backfill employees. Here we have a board for managing our open recs called TBH Management. It shows us KPIs around our open headcount, average time to fill. Below we also have recent attrition with some other information we'd get from our HRIS system. If somebody's left the company, in most cases there will need to be a backfill. So here we can create a new request. Once we've assigned the job role, Pigment will automatically populate our salary data into that new open rec and say who the role is the backfill for. Once we're happy with the details, we can submit an approval request which will go to a hiring manager. Hiring manager will receive a notification and they'll have this board where they can see all of the hiring approval requests. Once level 1 is approved, it will then pass to level 2. Then once level 2 is approved, update the board with all the kind of approved new employees. So 2 things to note here. First of all is that I'm showing you what this process looks like for requesting new employees, but you could have the same kind of process with multiple layers of approval for requesting a new vendor or even increasing your marketing spend. Second is that because Pigment has direct integrations into your payroll and HRIS system, you can automate the process of adding your hiring requests into your applicant tracking system, and then once the hire is made, it can automatically update your payroll and headcount information. That's a huge win if you're a rapidly scaling company, hiring lots of people in lots of different geographies. Before a company commits to a particular strategy, what they'll typically do is they'll ask their finance team to come up with a bunch of different scenarios, compare the impact of each scenario in the business. To create a scenario in Pigment, you essentially create a duplicate of your base model, change the inputs, and then compare the impact of each on pre-built charts and tables. To illustrate, we have a dashboard here set up to help us forecast purchase orders. If we wanted to compare the impact of adding an additional vendor, we'd first create a new scenario like this, then add in the vendor. Then we can just compare the 2 scenarios side by side on these 2 pre-built charts in a single click. Creating scenarios in Pigment is much easier than doing it in Excel. First, you don't have to create a duplicate of the model in a different workbook in order to compare the scenarios. Secondly, once you've created the scenario, it's very easy to compare them on charts and tables. But the scenarios feature in Pigment is still, according to them, a work in progress. So first of all, you have to pre-build all the charts and tables that you're going to later use. There's a bit of setup required. It's not as simple as it is to do it in a BI tool like Looker or Tableau, for example. Secondly, when you've gone through a couple of different scenarios and leadership decides, let's go with this one, to actually make that new scenario your default model is quite manual. You have to basically go and update the entire model. It's not as simple as just merging that new scenario and making it your default. Thirdly, currently, you can't collaborate on a scenario with members of your team. You only have two states for scenarios, which is private or public, where the entire organization see it. So finally, your data structure across the different scenarios basically needs to remain entirely consistent. You can't just create new objects or add a new line item. You essentially, when you can create a scenario, all you can really do is change the inputs of existing objects in your model. So that's the product tour. Let's talk about the implementation. The standard implementation for Pigment is about 12 weeks, but obviously that's going to depend on the complexity of your use case and the scale of your company, right? There are also two caveats. Firstly, Pigment stresses code build during the implementation process, and what that means is that your team is going to have to dedicate a significant amount of time every week over the course of several months to implementing Pigment. It's not just something you can hand off to them and have it up and running. Secondly, the 12 weeks kind of guidance to implement Pigment is really just for your initial use case. Let's say you wanted to get 3 statements up and running. Typically what customers will do is that they'll implement Pigment for a certain part of their business as a proof of concept, and they'll build out on it for other parts of the business over the course of several years. So implementation can really be thought of as a continuous process. It's not just something that you kind of do once and forget about. And then what happens after the implementation? Well, Pigment says after 12 weeks you should be pretty comfortable managing your entire model independently, and everything will be done. Customers that I spoke to paint a slightly different picture. First of all, depending on how technical your team is, the learning curve for understanding how Pigment works can be quite steep and also longer than 12 weeks. After the implementation, what you'll typically have is one kind of dedicated power user who understands the platform, dedicated to maintaining models and building new models and such. The transition from implementation to being fully self-serve in Pigment can be quite long, and you might need to rely on outside consultants in the interim. So it's worth keeping this in mind when you think about the total cost of ownership. My verdict on Pigment is that it's an insanely valuable tool that could save you a lot of time and just make it much faster for you to analyze your business and create forecasts. But if you're a startup of 1 to 200 people, frankly, I don't think this is the right platform for you. Firstly, if you're a high growth company, the likelihood is that you're probably constantly changing your model. So though Pigment is quite flexible, you can't change things as easily as you would in Google Sheets or Excel, even if you've totally mastered the Pigment platform. And that leads me on to my second point, which is that there's no getting around the fact that Pigment is a complex platform, and you're going to need to dedicate significant time and resources to learn it properly. These are just resources that you might not have if you're a 1 or 200 person company, right? Thirdly, to get the most out of Pigment, you really need to get a non-finance team brought in. They need to be able to use Pigment in order to provide inputs for the budget, maybe in order to request additional headcount, and that sort of thing. Depending on how mature your processes are, Google Sheets or Excel might just be a more natural solution for you to stay in if you're a smaller size company. Finally, before you begin the implementation, you need to make sure that all of your data is in kind of a good state, right? Otherwise, it's garbage in, garbage out. So Pigment just basically makes more sense when you already have good data and good processes around maintaining that hygiene of that data. And that's it on Pigment. In the next video, I'll be reviewing another hot SaaS company. So subscribe to my channel if you want to know when the next video drops or just to support me. As I said earlier, if there's any question on Pigment that wasn't answered in today's video, just drop me a comment and I'll either respond to you directly or make a whole nother video on the topic. Until next time.